Well, I want to welcome everybody here today. My name is Brad Jenkins. I serve as lead pastor here at Anthem Church. And if you're new with us here today, however you got here, whether somebody invited you or you just stumbled along and you're joining us here today, I just want to say you're now part of the Anthem family. We consider you family. We're so grateful that you're here. And if you're here for the very first time, I'd love for you to text hello to the number on the screen so we can begin to connect with you and help you get more information about our church and how you can get plugged in. By the way, I have one announcement as we start, and that is I'm excited to announce that on June 7th, at least here in Broken Arrow at our location, we're getting ready to reopen and start having services. That's all contingent on the stats and the direction of Tulsa continuing the trends that is on, but we're excited to be back together. There's something special when God's people are together in one place at one time, and so that's going to happen on Sunday, June 7th. We're going to have to modify our service, make some adjustments. We'll be sharing that in the days that are to come, but excited to have those back that are able and willing and ready to come back with us. But if you're not able to come back, I just want you to know we are committed to Anthem Church Online during the season and even past this season. We want you to keep connecting with us and getting part of all that God is doing here through our church, even online, as we proclaim the gospel, as we celebrate Jesus, we make much of Jesus together. We'd love for you to keep joining us. And so if you can't come back for maybe you live in a too distant from here, or maybe for health reasons or age reasons or whatever your reasons are, we want you to know that we'll continue to meet with you here through Anthem Church Online. So grateful that you're here specifically today as we continue the conversation we've been in over the last couple weeks about how to win at waiting. The reality is we're all in the waiting game, aren't we? We're all trying to figure out what normal is or what the new normal is. What is the future going to hold for us? And we say, if it's going to change, then let's just hurry up and get about whatever changes are going to happen so we can get on down the road. But we, during this series, are asking deeper questions. We're asking questions like, what does it look like to wait well? What does it look like to follow God in the waiting? What does it look like for us ultimately to win at waiting as we pursue God with every single one of our lives? I heard somebody say recently that some of the greatest growth comes out of the hardest seasons. I wish that wasn't true. I wish the greatest growth came out of the easiest, most fun seasons, but the greatest growth in my life, if I'm honest, has often been out of the hardest, most difficult season, the seasons of pain and difficulty and challenge and not sure where to go, left or right, and pushing through those seasons. And so my prayer for you is the same prayer I've been praying for myself. And that is that we would see in the midst of this season, not just something we endured, not just something we got through, but ultimately we'd say, you know what, God, you taught me some lessons during this season, during COVID-19 season and the year 2020 that traveled with me for the rest of my life, that I gained some life lessons that traveled with me all the way. And so that's the conversations we've been having over the last couple of weeks. And today is the final conversation we're going to have. So excited for this talk. I've been waiting for this moment for us to share that together. In fact, if you have a Bible here today, I'd like for you to grab that, or whether that's online or physically around you right now, grab a Bible, because I want you to take us all on a little bit of a journey here today through the book of Genesis, specifically the end of Genesis, starting in Genesis chapter 37, because we're going to come across this man named Joseph, who's going to wait a long time, and he's going to wait for the fulfillment of a dream that God gave him on one day, and yet he had to wait year after year until God fully revealed the dream for his life. I think this topic matters so much for me because I think sometimes in life, things just don't work out, right? You think you come up to a decision, you make a decision, or you're going forward, and things just don't work out. It seems like you did everything you could do, but things just don't go the direction you expect them to. And maybe you're praying about something. It just seems like God's silent. I've had those seasons in my own life where I've prayed about something repeatedly, some health things that I prayed about, some financial things I've prayed about, some relationship stuff I prayed about, some church stuff that I prayed about over and over again. And I felt like, God, where are you? You seem so silent in the midst of all of my prayers. And so the topic that we're talking about in waiting, and specifically related to the story of Joseph, is so important because in your life and mine is going to be filled with a lot of waiting. And as Christians, waiting is sort of the language of faith. It's the language of following God and trusting him in the midst of him not giving any kind of concrete activity around us from time to time as we continue to pursue him and try to see what he's asking us to do. And so in the middle of that, we say, well, what do we do in those moments when it seems like God is silent, or when it feels like nothing's coming together, or where it feels like I'm just waiting day after day for too long period of time? Because the reality is it becomes hard to keep the faith in those moments, doesn't it? You know, it's in those moments that our faith is challenged, where our faith is questioned, where we begin to have doubt, we begin to ask questions about what we believe and what we believe about God, even in our lives. And maybe not just about the existence of God, but about maybe the goodness of God, or maybe the activity of God, or maybe the awareness of God, or whether God actually pays attention to our prayers. It all happens in those moments. At least it does in my own life. And my guess is it does in yours as well. So the conversation we're having today really goes to this season. Sort of this season's been for me like a how long, oh Lord? How long is this season going to go? Or maybe you're not a believer here today, and I don't know where you are spiritually. Maybe you're asking questions like, do we really believe God exists? In light of everything that's happened in the world, wouldn't God just solve it? How long, oh Lord? Where is God in the middle of it? I think that's the conversation we're going to have today, and I think it's so critical to each one of us as we endeavor to follow after God. So let's talk about Joseph. Because the context of the story we're going to read today in the life of Joseph is a series of ups and downs, highs and lows, where he steps forward and he has setback after setback after setback, where he begins to say, you know what, it seems like my life is going to be nothing but waiting. And not only just waiting, as bad as that is, but pain in the middle of the waiting as I'm waiting for God to come through on my behalf. And so today I want to start at the beginning of the story in Genesis chapter 37, because Genesis 37 sets up all the waiting and all the reason for the waiting that's going to come for the rest of Joseph's life until God brings a breakthrough for him. So Genesis chapter 37, I just want to read these opening verses for us about Joseph's dreams. The story says in chapter 37, verse 1, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves, they gathered around mine and they bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he had told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing their flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to them, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flock. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they said to him, saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him, and let's throw him into one of the cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of these dreams. The story of Joseph is the story of a very hard life, of a lot of hardship, a lot of waiting. And this story begins when he's just 17 years old. He's just a young man. He's just coming to the age where he has responsibility and he has a sense of a foundation about who he is even as a person. He knows he's loved by his father, but how does he interact with his brothers? How does he interact with the world around him? And in that moment at 17 years old, God gives him a dream. I think it's interesting that Joseph's life, by the way, is going to be defined by dreams. He's going to be given dreams. He's going to interpret dreams. He's going to be this dreamer who has this insight and this relationship with God where God speaks to him in dreams. But why does God do this? I think that's the first question. Why does God give him a dream? Well, I think there's probably many reasons for it. But I know that one of the reasons that God would have given Joseph that dream is because God knew that the rest of his story, Joseph was going to have to hold on to the dream. That his life was going to be so hard, thing after thing, that he was going to have to hold tightly to that dream that God gave him, that vision God gave him at a young 17 years old. He said, I can't really deny it. God gave it to me twice. It wasn't just one night. He's like, God was repeating the same thing to me, and maybe I shouldn't told my family. Maybe I should have kept it to myself. I'm sure he went through all those conversations, but God knew he needed the dream because hope was going to be really hard to come by for the whole rest of Joseph's life as he grew up. Some of you have a dream. Some of you had dreams. Some of you had things that were aspirations and hopes for life, and you've struggled to see how those are going to happen. You're in the waiting, just like Joseph's going to end up in the waiting. Wonder where is God in the middle of that? Maybe that dream wasn't the right dream. And look, the reality is some of the dreams we had when we were 17, it's good for some of those dreams to die. Some of those dreams aren't from God, and they just need to go away. But some other things are things God's planted inside of us. That wasn't just a thought we had, it's something God put inside of us. And life has a way of beating the dream out of us as it's about to try to do to Joseph. And God knows we've got to hold onto the dream of a close relationship with God, a dream that we're not just going to live a normal life just like everyone else and miss out on what life is supposed to be, a life of purpose and destiny and fulfilling the purpose that God has for every single one of us. We've got to hold on to the dream. And God goes to Joseph at 17 and says, Joseph, you don't know what's next. You wouldn't volunteer for it. If I asked you whether you wanted to do it, you would say, I don't know. I need to think about it. I need to pray about it. And probably your answer would be no, but I'm going to give you a dream, because when you're in the middle of everything that's yet to come, you're going to have to hold on to the dream. And so here's Joseph's story. We can't read all of the rest of Genesis together. Here's Joseph's story. At 17, he's given a dream. At that same age, his brothers hear the dream. They find him out in the field. They take him. They threaten to kill him. The brothers have a conversation. Instead, they decide to throw him into a cistern. They see slave traders come by, and they say, well, you know what? Let's not kill him. Let's just sell him to slave traders. This is the beginning of this young man's life, sold as a slave to these people passing by, who then sell him to a man named Potiphar, who's very powerful in Egypt. And in Potiphar's house, it says in the passage in Genesis, the Lord was still with Joseph. He wasn't abandoned. He wasn't on his own. The Lord was with Joseph, and yet Joseph's working as a slave for Potiphar. And it says that everything Joseph did, God blessed. And as God blessed it, God really did a great work, and Potiphar saw it and began to put Joseph in charge of his entire household. In fact, that's going to be the other theme of Joseph's life. He's going to be put in charge of so many things going forward. Potiphar's house, and yet Potiphar's house is a great place for him, but Potiphar's wife sees Joseph and she wants Joseph, and in the end of the day, she ends up falsely accusing Joseph of assaulting her, which begins the downward track of his life once again, where he's falsely accused, he's thrown into prison, and yet there in prison, the Lord is still with Joseph. That God's plans for Joseph aren't off track, they're on track, but he's with Joseph in a prison, and the warden begins to put Joseph in charge of the prison while he's there. At 28 years old, 11 years after he's received the dream, there's two people that arrive in the jail, a butler and a baker, and they have dreams, and Joseph somehow, by the power of God, is able to interpret those dreams, and he says to them, just make sure and remember me when you get out of this prison here today. But they don't do that. They forget about him. It's just like thing upon thing where he's betrayed by his brothers. He's falsely accused. He's in prison. All these things are going bad in his life. It's a lot of hardship that's happening all around them, and they forget him once again until 2 years later, Pharaoh then has a dream. And one of them remembers, you know what? There was a man who interpreted my dream when I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew it was more than just a normal dream. It felt like it was something from God to me. And he was able to tell me what it is, and it came true. And they pull Joseph out of the prison at 30 years old, 13 years after the dream was first given. And Pharaoh brings him before him and says, I've had a dream. And Joseph said, I can't interpret dreams, but the God of the universe can do that. And if he would choose, he can tell me exactly what's happened in God allows Joseph to interpret the dream of Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh puts him in charge of Egypt. Isn't it interesting? A warden puts him in charge of a prison. Potiphar puts him in charge of the house. Pharaoh puts him in charge of Egypt. 13 years, though, of painful waiting in the middle of it with nothing more than a dream and God's presence for Joseph. And so if, as I said at the beginning of our conversation today, if some of the greatest growth comes out of the hardest seasons, what would you expect from a story like this? Talk about hard seasons. You would expect monumental growth. You would expect massive growth in a person's life, and that's exactly what God's doing in the life of Joseph and what God does in every single one of our lives when we lean into him, when we wait well, when we allow him to do his work in our life, even if it's painful, even if it's delayed, even if it's not what we would have imagined from the beginning, that God begins to bring about massive growth in our life. In fact, this story about Joseph is about character development. You know what God was doing? God was shaping Joseph's character so that he could be ready to do what needed to be done in all of Egypt. In fact, this man here today, God knew, I need a man he's not enamored with money or success or taking advantage of other people. In fact, I need a man who has empathy for the poor, empathy for those going through hardship. I need someone who, if they were in charge of all Egypt during a great famine where many people would die, I need the right person to be in charge of that moment, because you put the wrong person in that moment, they don't do what needs to be done. I need a certain kind of man. And so I'm going to have to take this man, this young man, through a journey to get him to where he needs to be so that he can be who he needs to be in the world around him. And so in this moment, what is God doing? Is he just forgetting about the dream? Is he forgetting about Joseph? No, it says God is with Joseph, and not only that, God is preparing Joseph to bring him into the moment that he was made for, to make such a profound difference in the world around him. All this wasn't a detour. It wasn't a distraction. It was the middle of God's plan, the perfect will of God for Joseph. This is a reminder for all of us, by the way, between the promise, whatever it is in our life, and the payoff. Between the promise and the payoff, there is a process. That God always takes us through a process. It's not just like dream fulfillment, like idea, and then you're able to accomplish it the next day. It's not like God tells you what's going to happen and it happens the next moment very often. Those times happen sometimes, but most of the time, between the promise and the payoff, there is a process. And it's in the process that God does some of the most important work in our hearts to form us into the image of Christ, to make us who we're supposed to be. It's in the waiting that God does the miracle in our hearts to shape us, to transform us, to make us new. And we say, God, can I just not wait any longer? Can we just fast forward this thing? And God says, I could fast forward it. It would be nothing for me, but you're not ready yet. You've got to go through the process. So when you get to the payoff that I promised from the beginning, you will be ready for what I have in store for you. And so in our life, we say God's in charge of the promise. God's in charge of the payoff, and God's also in charge of the process. And he knows that the big important work that needs to happen in Brad's life isn't in the fast forward. It's in the slow motion. It's in the process of the waiting, the preparation, the molding, and the shaping that God can do in the human heart. So between the promise and the payoff, there's a process. And God has you in the process and has me in the process every single day of our life, whether we recognize it or not. So let's focus on process for a moment, because that's the least fun word in that sentence. I love to have a promise. I'd love to have the payoff. The process is the part that I'm not so excited about. You know what happens for the 17-year-old boy? God shaped a 17-year-old boy who had a dream into someone who could rule over all of Egypt. He wasn't ready, but God was gonna get him ready. He put him to Pharaoh and to Potiphar's household. Why? Because he had to learn how to be in charge and make good decisions. He put him in a prison because he had to be there and have empathy for those in those situations. He had to learn what it meant to be in charge. Because he was in charge in Potiphar's house, he was in charge there in a prison. Then one day when the time was right, he could also be in charge over all of Egypt. And this is the track that God had him in. And that included brokenness, and that included heartache, and that included struggle, because God knew the empathy that would emerge from a heart like that when they've gone through that. if they lean into God, not give themselves to bitterness, if they lean into God and forgive those who harm them, that's the kind of person that God can use to care for other people who are also hurting. What a story. Starts with a dream. Then in between, what's the process? A pit, a slave, a false accusation, a prison, a forgotten man in prison. Then suddenly in the story, a savior for all of Egypt emerges from the story. And yet, suddenly, there was nothing really sudden to it. It wasn't sudden to God. He had Joseph in the middle of his plan to make him ready for this moment. I don't know about you, but I sometimes have trouble with the process. Anyone else have trouble with the process? I love to fast forward the process, but it's the process that gets me and shapes me into the person that I am supposed to be. We've been asking the question, how to win at waiting. And we've talked through many different aspects of waiting and different conversations. And we talked about lifting our eyes and knowing that God's present and swinging our hammer, all the things we've talked about over the last couple of weeks together to try to get a sense of how do we win at waiting. And we've been saying, well, what would Noah say to us? Or what would the people of Jericho say to us? What would Jesus and the temptations say to us? We've been asking those questions. I think the same question should be asked, what would Joseph say? If I just got to sit down with him at a table like this and said, Joseph, what would you say? How do I win at waiting? Because waiting's tough. And I think in light of the conversation we have about the promise and the payoff and the process, I think you know what Joseph would say to us? I think he'd say, it's not going to be easy, but I want you to trust the process. You've got to trust the process. You got to trust the one who's behind the process. You got to trust that God's going to get you exactly where you're supposed to be when you're supposed to be there. You know, wintertime's interesting because you look out, at least in our region and other places in the world, you look out at winter and it looks like nothing's happened during wintertime, right? It looks like everything looks dead, nothing's happening. It looks like there's no growth, everything's standing still, but that's not really true. That's not really what's happening in wintertime. Though things slow down from a biological standpoint in many ways, and trees and different things, it's not that nothing's happening. What's actually happening is it's getting ready for the next season that's in front of it. It's getting in preparation for spring. Without a proper winter, it would mess up spring and summer for each one of us in our life. In Joseph's own life, it looks like he's in winter, like God's not doing anything, but that's not what's happening. God's doing a lot. God's at great work, and he's preparing Joseph for what is to come, and the waiting is not wasted. The waiting's intentional. The waiting's a blessing. The waiting's a gift to Joseph, because if he would have fast forwarded, he would not have been ready for what was ahead of him. I heard somebody say this week, don't underestimate what God is doing in your season of waiting. You know, I needed to hear that. Don't underestimate what God is doing in your season of waiting. I said, God, what are you doing in my season of waiting? Anthem Church, what is God doing in your season of waiting? You know what, if I think about the story of Joseph, I think God is getting us where we need to be. It's a process. He's getting us where we need to be, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. What he's really doing is he's making us who we need to be. You know, I get so focused on where I need to go, the next thing, the next place, the next destination, the next accomplishment, where I need to go. But you know what God was really doing with Joseph? He was getting him to where he needed to go, but he was really making him who he needed to be. And that's the great blessing and the waiting. And Joseph would say, you are probably underestimating what God is doing in your season of waiting. You probably just think, I hope we can fast forward and get through it, but trust the process, trust the one who's behind the process, because some things can only be accomplished in the middle of the waiting. We've been singing a song together as a church, and song really all around the world that people are singing. I love the song. It's called Waymaker. It starts off with the idea that you're a waymaker. You're God, you're a miracle worker. You're a promise keeper. You're the light in the darkness. That is who you are. I love that, just setting up the character of God. But then it goes on to this other part of the song that says, even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. And I think probably some of us just need to hear that today. You know what? When it seems like everything's come to a standstill, it actually hasn't. God is still working. He never stops working for the good of his people, that they would know and become the people that he imagines for them to be. So we can't talk about the dream and the process without telling the end of the story, because the end of the story is so huge in the middle of it. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20 begins to have this whole moment where his brothers come and they're just trying to find food because they're starving in Israel, and they go all the way to Egypt and they appeal to this great powerful man who's handling all the food of Egypt and distributing it to people, and you got to kind of beg and get the affection of the leader, and they're there and they don't know it's Joseph. They just think they're there with an Egyptian, a powerful Egyptian, and yet it's Joseph on the other side looking different than they would have ever expected him to look, thinking probably he's dead or he's enslaved or he never expecting, and yet there his brothers are, bowing down before him. And he sees the dream come to life in front of him. Not the way he imagined it, not the way he saw it as a 17-year-old, but he finally saw it the way that God intended it from the beginning. And they're all there, and he reveals himself. It says, it's Joseph. And of course, they're scared for their life, thinking, what's he gonna do to us? But he has this big moment in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, and he says, look, let's just talk about the process, because what you intended for evil, God intended for good. What you thought was gonna harm me, God has actually used to shape me. It's in the waiting and the struggle and the pain that God has brought forth my whole destiny and what God has called me to from the very beginning. And in that moment, we see revealed that God enables a young boy who becomes a man 13 years later, lots of waiting, lots of transformation, goes through all the pain and the struggle, the false accusations, the pit, the betrayals, the late nights crying, feeling lonely, feeling isolated, feeling like his life isn't going where. And there he is, suddenly on the platform of the world to bring about a salvation through the physical provision for people, for all the world of that time. Who would have ever imagined that the destiny God had planted in him was so great and so significant that it would take a long process for God to bring it ultimately out of him. The cool thing about all this is because this family harmed Joseph and God turned it for good, he actually brought about them living and not starving, that he actually saves them from themselves at the end of the story. And that's what God does for all of us. I have this personal statement and this plaque. Christina bought it for me several years ago for some Christmas or birthday, and she bought it for me, and it's just begun to mean a lot to me. And I want to share it with you right now. It's this statement. It says that the man who walks with God always reaches his destiny. The man who walks with God always reaches his destiny. You know what that says to me? I don't have to be so consumed with my destiny. I don't have to think so much about my destiny. I don't have to fast forward the waiting. You know what I have to do? I just have to walk with God. Because the man who walks with God, he always reaches his destiny. The woman who walks with God always reaches her destiny. The child who walks with God always reaches their destiny. This is what God does for us. This is what Joseph did with him. So how do we win at waiting? What do? We don't have to worry about our destiny. We don't have to worry about where we're going. And I've worried about it way too much in my life. I just need to start thinking, how do I lean into God? And how do I trust the process? Because God's gonna bring out of the process of the waiting the person that he designed me to be from the beginning of time. I don't know where everybody is here today. I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what your struggles are. And maybe other people don't even know. Maybe some of those are hidden inside of you. Maybe you have things inside of you that feel like they're never gonna come to pass, and they feel like they're dying inside of you because of that. You hold on to the dream. If God's giving you a dream, you gotta hold on to it. And if you're not sure what the dream is, you gotta go search out the heart of God for your life. And you've gotta grab hold of the dream. Maybe it's a dream to follow God closely, not just to be a Christian who's just kind of doing the normal stuff. Or maybe like your friends, maybe you're not a Christian, you're not sure what to believe and what you're thinking. Just go through all those motions of life and say, you know what? My life's gonna be different. It's gonna amount to something. And it's gonna be about eternal things. And God would say to you, hold on to that dream. Come searching to the dream giver, because he's the one that you're going to find your purpose that you were created for from the very beginning. I'd like to say a prayer for all of us here today, wherever you're going, whatever you're going through, whatever your struggles are, whatever waiting looks like for you. I just pray that God would bring hope into your heart. He'd give you a new perspective, that the process is the most beautiful gift that God could give to you, and not to push through the waiting, but to get out of every second of every moment in the middle of the waiting God has for every single one of us. Let's pray together. Lord, I don't know what everybody's going through. I don't know what the struggles are. I don't know what waiting looks like for every person, but I do know what waiting feels like. And waiting feels hard, and it's challenging, and it takes a lot of patience, and it causes us to have to hold on to hope when we don't feel like we have anything else to hold on to. So for those who are struggling to hold on to hope and their dream and their purpose, and to hold on to just the idea that God sees them, knows them, and God is involved in what's happening in their life. Lord, I pray hope over every heart. I pray peace over every heart. I pray patience to every person. I pray that you help us to wait well, God, to know that between the promise and the payoff, there's an in-between, and that is the process, Lord, and you are the God of the process. Lord, help us to trust the process, to trust the one who's in charge of the process, to not just to try to create our own process, our own timelines, but instead say, God, I see you, I trust you, and I'm gonna wait, and I'm gonna look to you, and I'm gonna ask you to open up the doors that are supposed to open and close the doors that are supposed to be closed. And that's gonna require me to believe that your ways are better than my ways. So God, I pray that you help me to do that. I pray that that would be true for every single person, God. I pray that you would interact with them and you would draw them close to yourself even now, that they can believe and trust afresh here today. While we're still praying together right now, I don't know where everybody is spiritually. I don't know if maybe you've never given your life to Jesus. Maybe you never opened your heart to him. Maybe nobody's ever said at some point in life, you got to cross the line of faith. You got to make a decision, not just to believe about God intellectually, but you got to make a decision to follow God with your life. To say, you know what, I'm no longer gonna just solely be in charge of my life. I'm gonna let the God of the universe, the creator of all things, the maker of heaven and earth, I'm gonna let him be in charge. And I'm gonna believe in this man named Jesus, who died for me, for the payment of my sins, and he rose again on the third day. I'm just gonna believe in him. I don't know everything about the Bible. You may not know everything. I don't know everything, though I've spent my whole life trying to study it. We don't know everything, and yet what we do know, we walk forward in, and we cross the line. Wherever you are, I encourage you, cross the line of faith and trust Jesus. Others of you, you're Christians. You believe in God. You've made a decision to follow God. But right now in this season of life, you just feel a little off track. Maybe you're pushing against God, or you're trying to make your own plans be God's plans. And you're doing things, you just feel a little distant from God. And maybe that's due to your own sin. We all have sin. Or maybe it's pain that's been brought into your life that's made it hard to trust God and trust other people. Whatever that is, what do we do about that? We rededicate our life to Jesus. We ask God to come and heal the broken places, to bring light where there's darkness, to bring forgiveness where there's sin. And that's what we want to pray today. And if that's you right now, wherever you are, I'd just love for you to do something physical. If you just want to say that to God, maybe you're rededicating your life to him or giving your life to him for the first time. Will you do something physical? Put your hand on your heart or raise your hand or get on your knees wherever you are and just say, God, that's me today. I'm rededicating my life to Jesus. Or maybe that's you. You're giving your life to Jesus for the first time. I want to lead you in a prayer right now so that we can solidify that decision here together. And you can repeat after me. We pray this way. We say, Heavenly Father, I come to you a sinner in need of a Savior. I believe Jesus died for my sins and he rose again on the third day. And I'm choosing today to be done with sin, to receive forgiveness, and to follow you all the days of my life. If that's you, you just prayed that prayer. Maybe you never prayed a prayer like that before. Maybe you prayed that prayer for the first time, and maybe the first time in a long time, and you just made a decision. I just want you to do two things with me here today. I want you to tell two people before you go to bed tonight. I would like to be one of them, and you can do that by just texting Jesus to the number on the screen. I'm going to get that. I'm going to be aware of that. I'd love to come alongside you. I'm going to send you an email this week where you can go back and forth and let me know about the decision you're making, because I just want to stand in the gap with you and help you take next steps as you follow after Jesus. And then I'd like you to find one other trusted person to tell. Maybe there's somebody to text, someone to call. Maybe there's somebody you're sitting with right now. I just want you to tell them. Maybe you're a kid or a student. You want to tell your parents, tell somebody you trust. Just say, you know what? I don't know everything, but I feel like today I prayed that prayer and I was making a decision to become a follower of Jesus Christ or rededicate my life to Jesus. I just think God's going to do so much with that. As Anthem Church, we want to stand with you. We want to walk with you. We want to come alongside you as you take your first steps of following after Jesus. So excited for you. And church, I'm praying for you. I'm praying that God would see you through the waiting, that he would give you patience, he would give you strength, and he would give you vision. Vision that he is in charge and he is good and he's working out his plan. And between the promise and the payoff, it's too long, God. But between the promise and the payoff, you're doing a good thing for every single one of us. I'm praying for you, church. I love you. I can't wait to see you next week as we continue the journey of making much of Jesus together.